Everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining our Ask the Expert session today. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute, but just want to give people time to get logged on and get their audio settled. Again, thanks everybody for joining our Ask the Expert session today. We're really excited to have you and have this very important discussion. We have tons of questions to get through with Dr. Su, and we're so grateful for her time. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Our Ask the Expert, we have Dr. Maureen Su, who is actually a pediatric endocrinologist, but has extensive expertise in the immune system. Dr. Su, I'll let you give yourself a better introduction. Before we do that, I want to give a thank you to our sponsors of our Ask the Expert program. And then I just want to give everybody a quick reminder that during these programs, these are meant to be educational. So these are not going to be one-on-one sessions where we're able to troubleshoot your individual cases. This is all information for general purposes. Any information or any decision that you make should be with your own personal physician. The other thing I want to mention before we get started is that this topic is a very hot topic. We have tons and tons of questions submitted, and that is great. It can also be sometimes a very political and divisive topic. So I hope today that we can come to this with an open mind and realize that our goal is to learn about vaccines and our immune system strictly from the scientific perspective that Dr. Su is providing. As always, please make decisions, as I mentioned, about your health with supervision from your doctor. So Dr. Su, thank you again for being here. And today's program is all questions that have already been submitted. We're going to get to as many as we can, so please be patient with us. Before that, can you confirm today that all of your responses are going to be from your own expertise and knowledge? Have you been influenced at all by any of our sponsors?
Yeah, no, I actually have no conflicts for this.
Excellent. Thank you. And Dr. Su, do you want to tell us a little bit about your work and your training in the lab?
Yeah, so I am a pediatric endocrinologist, which is very unusual, I think. That means I take care of kids who are suffering from endocrine disorders like diabetes, thyroid, adrenal problems, and they tend to be kids who have an autoimmune cause for their problems. So my sort of career path was I went to college and medical school at Harvard. And then I did my pediatric training at UCSF, University of California at San Francisco, and got really interested in what the immunologists were doing in their studies of diseases that were caused by the immune system. And so I became a pediatric endocrinologist clinically, and then in terms of my research, I got really interested in understanding the genes and environmental factors that go into autoimmune conditions. And we actually did a lot of studies in animal models and made mutations in the genes of these animal models that resulted in spontaneous autoimmune disease. And one of the mutations we made had a disease that looked a lot like CIDP. And that's how I got into the CIDP field. So my clinical training was as a pediatrician, as an endocrinologist, interested in the immune system. And then just by chance, we made this mouse model that was probably, I would say, the best model, in my personal opinion, of what happens in a patient who has CIDP. And I've spent the last 20 years, really studying what first incites this problem, what causes it to keep going, what prevents it from stopping, what therapies potentially can be useful as preventative or as treatments. So that's career path-wise how I have become an expert in peripheral nerve autoimmunity, but I'm also a pediatric endocrinologist who sees children who have diabetes and thyroid disease. So everything I will say today is just from my academic interest in understanding the immune system, and it's not meant to be commercially or personally, particularly. It's from my point of view. So happy to take a stab at the questions that were submitted.
Yeah. Thanks so much. And we're so lucky to have you. And the foundation is so proud to have funded some of your work in the past. And we're so glad to have you as part of our Global Medical Advisory Board. We got a couple questions that were really general about kind of, first of all, why vaccines exist, how does the immune system work? How do vaccines make your immune system work? Kind of what is that big umbrella overview before we get into some of the disease-specific stuff?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So before I get into the science part, I also want to say that this foundation has been so seminal in allowing me to do a lot of the work we do. I've gotten a couple of grants now that has funded a lot of the research that we're doing to understand really the basic science that's underlying this autoimmune peripheral neuropathy that we study. So really grateful for all the patients and this foundation for that. So our immune systems exist because it's there to protect us against foreign invaders. So bacteria, viruses, funguses, fungi are all over, right? We know that, as we breathe, we're inhaling a lot of these foreign invaders. And the reason we don't get sick is because of our immune system. And so when we talk about the immune system in general, we're referring to what we call white blood cells. So when you go to the doctors and they draw your blood and they get a complete blood count and they tell you your white count, what they're telling you for us, the reason we do it is how robust is your immune system? Is your immune system overactive and therefore your white count's super high? Is it low and so maybe your immune system's not working as well as it should? So that's why we get this CBC, or complete blood count, and the white blood count. And so the white blood cells that circulate in us are made up of different kinds of cells. So there are quick responders. So if you get an infection, so for example, we inhale a virus, let's say the flu virus, into our lungs, that virus goes into our lungs and starts causing trouble, killing off our lung cells so that we can't breathe as well. We can't, get oxygen and get rid of our carbon dioxide as well. Our immune system gets alerted, and there's parts of our immune system like the macrophages and the neutrophils that will go into your lungs and start sounding the alarm, so sending off signals. So those are the fast responders, macrophages and neutrophils. And what they do is they bring in a very important part of the immune system called the T cells and the B cells. So those are the cells that we study a lot of, because even though those immune cells are a little bit slower to respond, they're not the first to get into the infection, they're the ones that are super specific. And in particular, the T cells are the ones that actually go and kill the virus infected cells. And that way, that's how you get rid of the viruses to begin with. And then the B cells are the ones that make antibodies, which I think many of us have heard about, which are these proteins that go and coat viruses, bacteria, fungi, and cause them to get eliminated from our bodies. So these T cells and B cells also are interesting because they are specific, meaning that we generate billions of different types of T cells and B cells. And in that huge repertoire, there are some that know how to respond against a particular virus. And so when we have an infection, those T cells that are specific and recognize that particular virus start making copies of themselves and proliferating and making lots and lots of copies, so that there's a big reaction against that infection. And then all the cells that got infected with the viruses get killed off. So what's even super important, even more important about the immune system is that it has something called memory. And what that means is that if you get infected with flu again, the second time, most people don't get as sick. So you might think like, you just have the same reaction, but no, your immune system is actually really dynamic. It remembers that the first time you saw this virus, it leaves behind like these little breadcrumbs basically, and these memory T cells and memory B cells that saw those, that recognize those viruses to begin with, actually persist in your immune system. And the next time you get that infection, it actually is able to contain that virus much better. It has a more robust response. It makes all the things that kill off that virus faster and with a greater, to a greater degree. And so you don't get as sick because your immune system now knows how to control it. And so memory is actually one of the greatest things about the immune system, is that you can get infected once, get super sick, the next time you're not going to be as sick. And so vaccines were developed to take advantage of this. So what the vaccines do is, instead of getting that first infection, like that flu infection, if you get the flu vaccine instead, Your body comes in, does the macrophage and neutrophil and T cell and B cell response, but nothing gets injured. Your lung cells aren't getting killed off. No viruses are going into your lung cells to kill it off. And then the next time when you really see a flu vaccine, the next time when you really see the flu virus, right? So this will be the first time you actually got the flu. Your body already has that memory response. And so it's super good at killing off that virus, right? So you don't get all the bad effects of getting that initial flu infection, but you get all the benefits of having the memory to it. So it was really, really, really smart for many reasons, including you don't get all that, the detrimental like lung injury, for example, that you get with COVID. Some viruses are known to like even harm the immune system itself, right? Some people have like this irreparable, if you get like infection in your brain, you can have like a bad outcome with having damage to your brain. You don't get that, right? Instead, you just get the memory response so that you can actually really control the infection when it really does happen as a real infection and not the vaccine. So in general, right, vaccines are a really good idea because it prevents that initial harmful infection. Still get like an achy arm, we kind of feel under the weather, we kind of feel like maybe a little feverish with some vaccines, but in general, it is a much less harmful response that we have to the vaccine than if we were to get the infection itself. So I know a lot of people, myself included, did not enjoy what it felt like to get the COVID vaccine, and like the flu for a few days. It's so much better than actually having gotten, if we had gotten the flu or the COVID itself, the infection. So that's the big picture, is that we're vaccinating so that we can develop memory without actually having the actual infection to begin with.
That's super helpful. And I was taking some notes there about memory and how these work. That's amazing. Thank you so much for that overview. We have some more specific questions about GBS and CIDP. And I want to remind all of the audience members that if you wanted to ask a question live, to locate the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can type your question in there. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. Like I said, we had a ton of questions pre-submitted, and we'll try to get to some live ones as well. Otherwise, our back-end team is going to be responding and providing some resources if we can't get to your question live. So this is the number one question we get every single year, and it was definitely the number one question we got for this program. Are vaccines safe for GBS-CIDP and MMN patients? And then specifically thinking about the COVID and flu vaccine. So let's start with that, and then we're going to build on it.
So the answer is yes. I know that when we go to CVS and when we go to get our vaccines, one of the questions that they ask us that we have to answer every time is, have you had a history of GBS, right? Which kind of implies to us like, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. And I don't know how that system worked out, but I understand why it causes so much questioning, and I totally understand where that's coming from. At the same time, in general, people who have autoimmune disease, including GBS, should be getting their vaccinations. And the reason is because actually getting the flu or actually getting COVID or actually getting pertussis puts you at even greater risk for having a GBS recurrence or having some other autoimmune disease than getting the vaccination itself. I know that there's been case reports in the literature that I've been reading as they've come out of people who have gotten autoimmune disease, including GBS, within a short window after getting their vaccinations. So 6 weeks is usually the time frame we say. So a lot of times people think, well, is it because of the vaccinations that I got my GBS? Or is it because of the vaccinations I got my Graves' disease? There's also been case reports of people who've gotten infections with COVID or infections with flu, and as a result gotten GBS or other autoimmune disease. And so if you look at the data as a whole, the people who got the actual natural infections are at higher risk for developing GBS and other diseases, and the vaccinations are actually protective. So there are good studies now, and one just came out in Lancet this last month that show that on a population basis, having these viruses that we're all worried about, like COVID and flu, put you at greater risk for developing autoimmunity, probably because it does something to the immune system. But the vaccination is actually protective against the autoimmune diseases. So I would say in general, even though we're asked when we get our vaccinations if we've had GBS, and that sort of implies that there's something to be worried about, people should be getting their vaccinations. There are some cases where the risks and the benefits of getting the vaccination may not be the same for everybody. And so if you think that perhaps the risk might be greater for you, that's something to discuss with your doctor of getting the vaccination, or if you feel like the benefits of getting the vaccination might be more, that's also something to talk to your doctor about. So I think there's some things that might be individual that are definitely worth talking to your doctor about. But in general, yes, so people with GBS should be getting their vaccinations.
Yeah. The follow-up, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, is that if somebody had GBS and they feel confident and their doctor also feels confident that a vaccine caused it, should they avoid all vaccines? Should they avoid just the vaccine that they think caused it? Or do you have any thoughts on, the future going on from there if they and their doctor both feel confident that it was caused by a vaccine?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And people are trying to study that question. So in general, like if you got a vaccine and got GBS within 6 weeks after that, I think there's a precaution where the recommendation is that you talk to your doctor about the risks and the benefits of getting the vaccination again. For people, for example, who might have an underlying condition that makes them immunocompromised, and maybe they can't fight off the virus itself very well, then the vaccination makes a lot of sense. But there's also a lot of other factors to go into it. So there is a recommendation that there's to use some caution, and that's why they asked that question at CBS.
Yeah.
If you have had GBS within 6 weeks of getting a vaccination in general.
Yeah. So it sounds like if you and your doctor feel confident a vaccine caused your GBS, you need to have that conversation every year about, what is the risk benefit ratio. I'm remembering something you said about the immune response, and that, when it is a real virus coming into your body and causing the destruction, and the response from your body is so great. And that's what's nice, like you were saying about the vaccines, is that it's not a live actual thing that's wreaking havoc in your body. Is that fair?
That's right. There are some attenuated live virus vaccines where they take the virus and kind of make it less strong. Maybe they weaken it. But in general, like COVID, flu, those are not live attenuated. So, right. So we're not getting the actual virus itself. We're just getting little bits of it.
Yeah. That kind of leads into another question we had about, can you give a little bit of a description of the mRNA vaccines and how those are made?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the big breakthroughs, actually. One of the reasons that I think the vaccines were developed as quickly and have been available to so many of us is because they're based on mRNA. And the manufacturing base in general is a lot easier with these vaccines than if you use the traditional kind of vaccines. And it also allows us to change the strain of virus that we're vaccinating against much more easily. So that's another huge advantage of this mRNA vaccine. What it means for us, those who are receiving the vaccine, is that our body is kind of the factory that's making the proteins, the pieces of the virus that the immune system is going to get educated on, rather than using cell lines or things like that people used to do to make vaccines, right? The RNA is what actually encodes the proteins, and those are being done by our bodies itself. And that's how we get the shot, and our muscle takes up the RNA and turns it into the parts of the virus that help educate our immune system. So it's a little bit of a different concept, but I think in general, it's been very, very effective. And it's allowed us to scale up our vaccine production and to change it in a way that was not possible before. So it's really been a big breakthrough.
Big breakthrough. Yeah, very much applauded by the scientific community. This is an interesting question. Why are vaccine doses not weight dependent? So, I get the same dose as my husband, who obviously does not weigh the same as me.
And pediatrics, right? Like little babies, right? Like, yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think most of the studies are probably done starting with the dose and looking for efficacy. It kind of makes sense to do it by how big you are, because right, like we dose a lot of medicines that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that it might partly be just because we did our studies with that particular dose, and a lot of times we do it in adults first, and then as a pediatrician, I kind of we often have to like learn what we can from the studies done in adults because we don't want to put kids at risk, and right, and so and then we kind of see if it works in kids, and if it works then we keep going with it. But it's a good question. I think there's probably a good reason to start looking at whether or not different doses may give you benefit without all the side effects, like all the febrile things if we decrease the dose. But I think at this point, with the pandemic, the interest is really in like, let's just make sure everybody's safe. And then these other questions we can work on later, but I don't think we know.
Yeah. Interesting. That is interesting. And it sounds like vaccine technology is constantly evolving. Is that fair?
Very fair.
Yeah.
At UCLA, a lot of my colleagues are working on vaccines for emerging viruses, as well as ways to make existing vaccines better. So I think, yeah, it's definitely an active field, and everybody's trying as hard as they can to, make sure that we're ahead of the game in terms of predicting what's going to be coming next and trying to protect people with vaccines.
Yeah. Yeah. Moving to another question that we just had submitted, can you talk a little bit about the side effects from the COVID and flu vaccine? You kind of mentioned the sore arm and the achiness, but let's put a spin on that and think specifically about the CIDP and MMN community who sometimes have that, the weakness in the extremities and things like that. Have you heard of those kinds of symptoms coming up? And does your recommendation change based on, if they're going to feel a flare up, quote unquote, of their condition?
Right. So just to take a step back, when we're first talking about the immune system and memory. So one of the things that people have hypothesized is may cause GBS is faulty memory. And what I mean by that is that something about an infection that somebody got. So in the case of GBS, I think Campylobacter jejuni is a bacterial infection that's often in about 30% of people develop GBS, antecedent infection, meaning that they had this infection, pretty close to when they developed GBS. And so one of the thoughts is that your immune system saw the Campylobacter. There's something in the Campylobacter that may resemble your nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And then for some reason, something didn't quite translate correctly. And your immune system looked at your nerves and thought, this looks like Campylobacter, I need to keep fighting it. So it's in a lot of ways like a faulty memory response. So one thought is like, if you then give a vaccine that might have some of the parts that resemble, your immune system thinks looks a little bit like your nervous system, is it possible then that you might have a little bit of a reaction against that? And so there have been a lot of questions about that. I've read some case reports where people have gotten their vaccines and felt a flare-up of their symptoms. They often respond to treatment, and they're often short-lived. But one thought is it because now we've once again stimulated that faulty memory? It's also possible that in general, we've just kind of revved up the immune system with a vaccine because those macrophages and neutrophils are on alert and calling T cells and B cells, to come and do their job. And so it's not totally clear, but I think my sense is from what I've read is that this this is something that has been reported, and it's concerning, especially for people who don't, who haven't had good responses to their treatment. But the case reports that I've read have described it, but it's been something that's been manageable with some of the medications that they're using for CIDP, GBS.
Yeah. Well, my mind goes to, somebody might have that response to the vaccine, but if they were to actually get that virus, the COVID or the flu virus, it would likely also trigger those CIDP and MMN symptoms again.
Right. And possibly do something even worse, right? Because it's also causing lung damage, and it can also cause not just flares of the GBS, but trigger other autoimmune diseases. So there's a lot of reasons why that vaccine in general is a lot safer than actually being at risk for the natural infection.
Yeah. This kind of goes hand in hand with some of the questions we got about timing. Specifically, I was thinking about if CIDP and MMN patients are thinking about getting their vaccines, maybe they have a conversation with their doctor and have that treatment ready, like thinking about when they're going to get their IVIG treatment. We got lots of questions from people about if the timing of the IVIG treatment impacts the effectiveness of a vaccine at all.
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually looked into that because I think it's a really interesting question. IVIG kind of has two different uses in the medical world. We use it for autoimmunity, like for CIDP and GBS. And some people actually get it because their B cells are not making antibodies very well, and so they get IVIG infusions for that too. So it can be either something that prevents you from having a good response to your vaccines, or it could be something that helps you have a good response to your vaccines because you now have some antibodies that could work well. So IVIG is a tough one. I think what I've seen is that people have recommendations for if you're getting B cell depleting therapies like rituximab or T cell depleting therapies. And the reason is because if you vaccinate somebody who's getting a B cell depleting therapy, they may not have that B cell response that you want. Similarly, for T cell depleting therapy, if you get that vaccine, your T cells may not be responding the way you want to have, to make a good memory response, really. In that case, the suggestion is to get the vaccination before you get the B cell, T cell depleting therapy, at least 2 weeks before. And that way, hopefully you'll have generated your memory response, it'll be there, and then when you do the B cell depleting therapy, T cell depleting therapy, then your memory T cells will keep going.
Yeah, I want to just punctuate that because we did get a lot of questions as well about rituximab. I think lots of CIDP patients are taking Rituxan or rituximab. So you're suggesting probably about 2 weeks before the Rituxan or rituximab therapy. That's about what the literature is saying, to make sure that they get that response, and then the Rituxan depletes the B cells to do what it needs to do for the condition.
Yeah, and the memory lives on in general, we hope, we think. So that, I think that's an area that really needs to be studied further now that we have these immunotherapies, but that's the current recommendation.
Gotcha. And so for IVIG, it sounds like it's a conversation with the doctor and really kind of how the person is doing in their typical therapy.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't have that T cell depleting effect that some of these other medications do. So.
Yeah, very interesting. So we had a couple more, we have tons more questions coming in and submitted. So I'm going to go on to that was pre-submitted. And we've kind of talked about this. So statistically, would GBS be more likely from a vaccine or from the illness/virus itself?
Definitely the illness/virus itself. So those numbers are very clear. So if you wanted to look at this article that came out in Lancet September 2023, which is this month, right? There's about like a 1.3 hazard ratio, meaning like you're at increased risk if you have a natural COVID infection, but you're actually like 0.8, which means that you're less likely to get it if you've gotten 2 COVID vaccines. So for sure, having the natural infection puts you at greater risk.
Yeah, and probably the same for the flu.
Yeah, same for the flu. So the risk of developing GBS with flu was really coming out of this 1976 flu epidemic. And after that particular epidemic, the link between flu and GBS has not been as clear. So I think a lot of the worries about flu have come from that 1976 pandemic, and I think it's good to remember it and to be vigilant about it. But I think it's certainly something that has not been as obviously linked since then.
Yeah. I do want to take a moment because we are serving a rare disease community, and then there are people who are even the rare of the rare who definitely got GBS from one of these vaccines, and we just want to acknowledge that it's definitely possible, right, that can happen.
Absolutely. And so I think that's one of the hardest things, right, is that for that particular rare individual, right, who did have GBS develop very close to having gotten a vaccination, and the doctors are like, yes, we think that these are probably linked, right? All these numbers that we're throwing around are not really helping, with their particular situation. But if we look at it from like a 20,000-foot view and try to see what happens on average, we think that vaccinations are protective in general, even though there have definitely been cases where the two of them have been closely.
Yeah. And the treatment, I believe, stays the same. And I just want to acknowledge that the Vaccine Injury Fund and the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program are resources for people who believe and their doctor believes that they did have GBS or another condition similar from the vaccine. So highly recommend looking into those. Yeah. And Dr. Su, I wanted to move into, we talked about COVID and flu, but we also got lots of questions about pneumovax and Shingrix. And I think specifically, there's a couple parts to this question. So Shingrix has a warning from the FDA about GBS. Can you talk a little bit about how that happens and why it happens?
Yeah, so I was reading about this yesterday. I think the thought is that the vaccine is recommended for people age 50 and greater. And the risk of GBS, we know, also increases in those who are 65 years and older. So there's this correlation in just people being at risk for GBS and when they're actually getting the shingles vaccine. So it's rare, but there have been links where people develop GBS after getting the shingles vaccine. So there's a notification out by the FDA, but they've actually not made any changes to their vaccination recommendations. So I think this is something to discuss with your doctor for your personal situation. And I think we need to do further studies to really understand if that link, how strong that link is, or if it's more of a population because those who are at risk are getting the shingles vaccine that we're seeing this.
Interesting. So it's a little bit of the correlation and causation, chicken or the egg, which is coming first. Right. Do you still believe that those two particular vaccines are generally safe for CIDP, GBS, and MMN patients?
Yes. So I think in general, they are safe for patients, and it's definitely one of these. We will encourage you to talk to your doctor about your personal risks and benefits. But yes. For the pneumovax one that you were asking about, I didn't see as much in the literature about that link, but I think shingles has been like at the forefront of the FDA's mind because it's something that people have reported.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a little bit of a vaccine break and go back to the immune systems. We had a couple questions, some people asking, how can we strengthen our immune system? So vaccines are one way, but do you have any other advice for strengthening our immune systems, especially as we enter flu and COVID and cold season?
Right. So our immune systems are not just like static, like shields, right? Like they're dynamic. And we were talking about memory, and we're talking about, different things that you can do to kind of help educate it, to help make it like be able to anticipate what's coming. So truthfully, one of the best things you can do is to get vaccinated, right? Because you are then educating your immune system about what is to be guarded against, right? Who the enemy is, and making sure that you have memory cells there to react quickly and powerfully when you actually do get that infection. I know there's a lot of like Amazon, supplements that you can do to boost your immune system, vitamin C supplements, zinc, I get the advertisements too. In general, I would say just keeping your body healthy, right, is probably a very smart thing to do. Eating right, exercising, mental health. We know that a lot of like stress and anxiety can depress your immune system, right? Everything's connected. And so I would say to making sure that your health is first, and doing the things that we all need to do to make sure that our minds are at ease and happy and peaceful is super important. And that's my personal opinion, and I try to practice it. But I think that's one thing that we've all gotten very educated about in the last few years, is how important just mindfulness and having mental health be also an important part of our healthy lifestyles is. So yeah, I think that in general, just keeping your, making sure that you get some exercise in there, both for mental and physical health.
Yeah. And some sunshine. You live in California where you get lots of sunshine, but here on the East Coast, we struggle with that.
Yeah, I was in North Carolina for 8 years and then in Boston for 9 years. So yeah, I understand. It does make a difference, right? Getting outside and
Yeah.
getting some of the natural input.
So I'm looking through some of the questions that we are having submitted live. The one, I want to go back to the vaccine. Sorry, I took us on gave us a little vaccine break, but we're going to go back to the vaccine questions. And we talked about with CIDP and MMN, the vaccines can sometimes kind of trigger those symptoms or give a flare up. But what about GBS? So we know GBS is treated once typically in the hospital. You're not doing ongoing IVIG therapy, but that some people do live with residuals from that GBS.
Right.
So if they get a vaccine and feel kind of a boost of those residuals, should they seek out treatment, or what would your recommendation be? And I apologize, this is a little specific. I know we're not trying to do a case by case, and this is by no means, advice for you as an individual, but this is educational for the community's knowledge.
Right. I think in general, if you start feeling symptoms and you've had a history of GBS, it probably is a really good idea to talk to your neurologist and to get some medical input about what's going on, and make sure you let them know that you recently got a vaccination so that they can think about how that might be playing into it. But I think in general, it's probably a good idea. There was a series of GBS patients who were followed after getting vaccinations, and there was, I think in that series, one patient who had some of these potentially flare-ups of their GBS symptoms. They were seen in the ER, they were seen by their neurologist, and things resolved from there. So there are people studying cohorts of patients with GBS and what happens with their symptoms after vaccination. And it's recent, I think that was actually published this month as well. But
Yeah.
more to be there, yeah.
Interesting. So I'm thinking GBS patients might not have a neurologist that they're seeing regularly. So at that point, would you say, make sure their primary care doctor knows that they had a history of GBS, and that would maybe be the first contact then?
That's right. Yeah. Whoever their person of their primary care physician is.
Yeah.
For you if they need to.
Taking a hard left turn here, we have another question back about rituximab. So after the B cells have been suppressed by rituximab, will they be damaged permanently from that, or do they regain their strength and return to normal after stopping the drug?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in general, your B cells will come back if you stop the treatment, right? And the question is whether or not those memory B cells are at all affected, right? Because we want our memory to be there so that you can respond quickly. There's some thought that some people might need to get revaccinated if their memory is not as good as it could be. But I think that's something that after, if your treatment is over and your doctor feels like there's going to be a span of time where you're not going to have the treatment, right? Where you might want to think about, talk to your doctor about whether or not the vaccinations that you received beforehand might need to be boosted after your treatment. But yeah, I think everybody has an individual case, and I think it depends on what your treatment course is going to look like. If it's if it's something that that you're done with, and it's definitely worth talking to your doctor about.
Interesting. Okay. I thought this question that came through might trigger an interest with your genetic background as well. If two siblings have CIDP, does a third sibling need to be careful of COVID or flu vaccine? So we kind of covered this a little bit with, you're more likely to get GBS from the COVID or flu vaccine. We don't see that as much with CIDP. But just thought with your genetic interest, two siblings of CIDP, should a third sibling be cautious of their vaccine intake at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In general, we know that there are certain genes that predispose you to getting autoimmunity, and we know that autoimmunity tends to run in families, which is, I think, why the question is being asked. So if you are somebody who might be at higher risk because of your family history, right, is vaccination something that you should be worried about? I think, once again, I think it would be probably even more important for this person to think about getting vaccinated, because actually getting the infection might put you, the infection plus your family history might put you at really high risk for developing an autoimmune disease. And so the vaccinations might actually be protective. Once again, though, if there are mitigating circumstances, something you need to talk to your doctor about. But I think in general, the idea that the infection is more predisposing to autoimmunity is still there, even in people who have strong family histories of autoimmunity.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I think the vaccination is probably even more important here.
Even more important. I think, we can't emphasize enough that statistically, the actual virus is more likely to cause GBS or one of these other autoimmune conditions, maybe CIDP or MMN. The actual virus is more likely to cause these conditions rather than the vaccine.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go back a little bit we'll take another little vaccine break and go back to the immune system. Can you talk at all about the role of the immune system when people have some of those residuals, such as numbness, fatigue, pain? Do you know what is happening in the immune system to kind of cause those long-term residuals?
That's a really good question. I think we are now appreciating that the immune system plays a bigger role than we ever thought. I think in the old days, we used to think residuals was just, leftover damage that your body was having trouble healing. But I think there's also some interest in trying to understand if maybe the immune system still has a little bit of a response against your nervous system, and that's what's causing the residuals. I don't think we know. There are a lot of viral infections that have some peripheral neuropathies, like HIV, for example. There's some neuropathies that can go along with HIV infections, and how much of that is the immune system versus whatever damage happened to your peripheral nerves. So I think it's a really interesting question that we don't know the answer to and should be studied. Is this something that we can potentially make better by modulating the immune system, even after the initial disease is over and this is residual symptoms? So I guess the short answer is we don't really know, but I think that there's a good chance the immune system is involved, but we need to study it better.
Yeah. Great area to be studied, and I hope that our young fellows and residents that are coming up and interested in GBS-CIDP also take an interest in the immune system. And I hope, Dr. Su, that you will encourage them that as well and let them know that the foundation does have research funding available.
Yeah, absolutely. That I think in general needs a lot more understanding and a lot more research to be done. And that's what you guys are doing. So yeah, but we need our trainees, we need the next generation to be part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Some more immune system questions. CIDP symptoms triggered by food and environmental substances. Have you seen that with other autoimmune illnesses? And then a question came in and I lost it, forgive me, but about the gut microbiome and the immune system. So I feel like that's all kind of related. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So there is a lot of work being done on the microbiome and GBS-CIDP because I think we mentioned before that GBS is preceded by this Campylobacter infection 30% of the time, and that's a diarrheal illness where people have the gastroenteritis. So in many ways, there's this link between what happens in your gut, right, in the microbiome there, and the autoimmunity that happens in your nerves. And I think for a lot of autoimmune diseases, we're coming to the realization that what happens in your gut is very related to what happens in autoimmune disease. In type 1 diabetes, for example, we know there's a strong link between celiac disease, so having an allergy against gluten, and having type 1 diabetes is very strongly linked. So in general, that link is definitely something that has a lot of smoke, and I think we need to kind of explore more. As far as the question of diet and environment and how that might influence your risk for developing an autoimmune disease, that is, for me, the million-dollar question. We know that the incidence of autoimmune disease has risen astronomically in the last few decades, too fast for it to be genetics. Our genetics, require generations for things to kind of change, whereas how many people are developing autoimmune diseases has risen so fast that it has to be something not genetic. So one thought is that maybe it's the way we're living now, the environment that we live in, the foods we eat, and how is that being translated into how our immune system functions. There's a field that my lab actually works in called epigenetics. What we're interested in is understanding how the environment actually changes the way your gene codes, your genes code for different parts of your immune system. So it's not the actual DNA code itself, but it's actually how it gets expressed. So I think that trying to understand how the environmental influences in our lives have predisposed the world really to autoimmunity is one of the biggest questions to be answered. And this has gone along with a decrease in the infections that we've seen in some of the countries that have the highest rates of autoimmune diseases. So in some of the most economically developed countries, the rates of infection have been fairly low compared to what they were just a few decades ago. And at the same time, the lowering of infectious diseases have been coincident with an increase in autoimmune disease. And so this is called the hygiene hypothesis, where cleanliness or a lack of being exposed to a lot of the foreign invaders and other bacteria, viruses, and funguses in our lives perhaps is influencing how our immune system is seeing our own body, and how does living in a cleaner industrial world influence that is a big open question that we need to understand better.
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially the environment and the epigenetics, and that's all a relatively new field, right?
Yeah. It's a very new field. I think 20 years ago, we were trying to unravel what's happening with DNA codes and what it's coding for and what we inherited. And now we're trying to understand how what we inherited is interacting with the world we live in. And even if we have the same DNA codes, they may manifest differently depending on the environment that we're in.
Interesting. Okay. Going back to some other of the questions that we had, we have about 10 minutes left. So if you have any more questions, try to get them in. We're going fast and furious on the back end as well, trying to make sure everybody gets an answer. I wanted to ask specifically about people who are pretty immunosuppressed, taking immunosuppressants for one reason or another. Can you talk about how a vaccine impacts that person? And then maybe talk a little bit about kind of the community around them and why it's important for those people to get vaccinated as well.
Right. So I'm going to answer the second part first, I think. So one of the great things about vaccination is that people themselves are not the only ones who are getting protected. They're protecting their friends around them as well. What that means is that if your immune system is healthy, right, but you're living with somebody who doesn't have the ability to mount a good immune response against a virus, right, you're getting vaccinated actually protects them because you're not bringing home the virus and they're not getting exposed to that virus. So it's super important if you're living with somebody who's immunocompromised to get vaccinated because you don't want to bring that natural virus home. And if somebody has immunosuppression for many reasons now, people who've gotten transplants, organ transplants, bone marrow transplants, people who have autoimmune disease and are getting T and B cell immunosuppressants, people with cancer, right? So there's lots of different people who have immunosuppression, meaning that their immune systems are not as strong as they could be, right? In general, the vaccinations are super important because you'd rather have the vaccination than to get the natural infection, right? Because if you got the natural infection, your immune system wasn't working well, that virus or that bacteria can really take over and cause a lot of problems. So people who are immunosuppressed, sometimes they'll get a fungus infection that most people, it wouldn't even bother them, but they would get super sick because that fungus would take over and your immune system couldn't really fight it off. So if you can get a vaccination, that is a great idea in general, because then you would be better poised to fight off that infection. But we also know, like we were talking about before, that if you are taking some of these immunosuppressive medications, that you might not mount as good of a memory response as if you had an intact immune system. And so some people might need an extra dose of the vaccination. So I think there are guidelines out now for COVID that you might need to get an extra dose if you are immunocompromised. If you know that your body cannot mount as good of a response against the natural infection, if you get the natural infection, you definitely need to let your doctor know so that they can treat you with some of these medications that people have developed, antivirals that can help just lessen the burden of that virus. But the best is to really have your memory cells be primed and ready to react against the natural infection if you were to get infected, by getting that vaccination and getting potentially an extra vaccination to make sure that that memory response is there.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about who in the GBS-CIDP and MMN community might be immunocompromised? Specifically, if somebody's taking IVIG, are they considered immunosuppressed? Rituximab, are they immunosuppressed? Steroids, I know a lot of people take steroids. Can you speak a little bit about what medications might our community be using that would suppress their immune system?
Right, so the steroids are kind of a global immunosuppressant, meaning that it will prevent your macrophages and neutrophils and your T cells and your B cells from working like they normally do. So people getting some of those glucocorticoid treatments, especially at the higher doses, are considered immunosuppressed. Those who are getting therapies that make their B cells not work or deplete them, T cells depletion therapies, those are immunosuppressants. IVIG, I think, is actually one of those categories that's a little bit in between, like we were talking about earlier. Like I said, some people actually get IVIG if they don't have B cells that make antibodies on their own. So it's kind of this category. People were looking into whether IVIG might be a treatment for COVID. I think that's really not panned out, but something that early on was thought to be potentially a treatment for. So it's one of these gray zones, the IVIG itself, in terms of whether or not it's helping your immune system or it's an immunosuppressant. I think in general, we don't consider it an immunosuppressant like we do for some of these B-cell and T-cell depleting medications, or for the steroids, the glucocorticoids, which is a type of steroid treatment. But certainly something I think to think about and to discuss with your doctor, the timing of treatment, whether or not there might be a window where you're treatment free and that you can get your vaccinations just to be safe. But I think in general, getting your vaccinations if you're on IVIG is a very good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it's a conversation with your doctor and trying to figure out your own response to those vaccines. But it can also help to be a nice conversation with your loved ones around you of, oh, I'm on IVIG, so you should get your vaccines to help protect me some more and help protect me from having that flare up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's an important thing to do, not just for yourself, but for everybody around you.
Yeah. Community health at its best.
That's right. That's right.
So we've talked a lot about GBS-CIDP and MMN, but we also have some other variants of those conditions. And I just wanted to take the last couple of minutes to see if you had any thoughts or specific recommendations for some of those more rare variants, such as Miller-Fisher and anti-MAG. Is there anything different about their vaccination schedule or treatment schedule that comes to mind?
No, I don't. I don't think so, like on a global level, but I think if there's particular treatments that you're getting for those conditions that you're thinking might be immunosuppressing, right, definitely ask your doctor if this is something that I need to think about when I'm getting my vaccinations, about whether or not I need to wait and give myself a little head start, 2-week head start, like we were talking about before, to get the vaccination first and then to resume or to start your treatment schedule.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Dr. Su, we're coming up at like the 3-minute mark, and I don't want to start any longer questions. I want to thank everybody for all of the pre-submitted questions and the questions that came through live. Dr. Su, do you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share with the group while we still have you?
Yeah, I think we just need to emphasize once again that vaccinations, although there are rare cases where they've been associated with GBS, right? In general, vaccinations are very, very protective, and something that we would recommend for people with GBS, because it prevents you from getting that natural infection, which is really the one that we're worried about.
Absolutely. And the same for CIDP, MMN, and those other variants.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And as always, make sure that you have a conversation with your doctor. So I'm going to end our program just with a quick reminder and thank you to our sponsors for sponsoring our Ask the Expert webinar series. And a reminder that our symposium is next week. So if you're not registered, you should register now. There's going to be sessions like this, maybe not on this exact topic, but like this, where you get to ask your questions to some of our Global Medical Advisory Board experts. Finally, we'll be sending out a survey very shortly about this program, and we would love to hear from you about what worked, what didn't work, and all of that good stuff. So please check your email for that. In the meantime, thank you again so much, Dr. Su, for your time and your expertise. You reiterated at the beginning, but this was all from your own knowledge and experience, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.